So I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about genetics and your CPMC results for anybody who has any questions about interpreting them. One of the things that we think is important and we share with participants for every result that we report on is that all of the diseases that we talk about are in part genetic and in part environmental. And so we try and show you with the scale what the ratio is of genetic to non-genetic contributing factors. You can see here that there's this whole bucket of little green balls here. And what we're trying to tell you is that there are multiple genetic factors. So even though we've tested and told you about one genetic factor, there's actually a lot that contributes to this 88%. So unlike diseases like cystic fibrosis, which some of you might have heard about, or Duchenne muscular dystrophy, where there's one single gene that causes one disease. If you have a mutation in this gene, you will get this disease. The diseases that we talk about in the CPMC are not really like that. They really are caused by a complex interplay of genetic factors and environmental factors all working together. There's no one factor that's going to cause this disease. So when we think about the genetics of type 1 diabetes, and Dr. Haddad had mentioned that there are differences between type 1 and type 2 diabetes. Although the long-term complications and the impact on your body are the same, the root cause is actually different. There's two different mechanisms that are happening. In type 1 diabetes, it's really an autoimmune disease. So it's your body attacking itself, attacking the beta cells in the pancreas, and so those are destroyed. So when we think about, okay, what genes might be causing this, what we have found is that the majority of genes that influence the risk for type 1 diabetes are, are located in what's called the major histocompatibility complex. And this is an area of your genome that controls autoimmunity and your immune response. So these are the genes in your body that say fight that infection or attack that particular cell because it's diseased or there's something foreign in your body. And there are actually 3.6 million letters that make up that region. So it's a pretty big part of your genome. You have 3 billion letters in your genome. This is about 10% of the letters that make up your genome tell your body how it should react to foreign substances and respond to disease. So there are a few specific regions of this called the HLA complex that identify foreign substances. And there are multiple genes within that region that have been associated with type 1 diabetes. This is just a little pictorial. If you look at one of your chromosomes, this is the section that's associated with these particular genes. So to give you a sense, although we've told you about one gene, we've told you about this one, HLA-DQA1, there are a number of other genes that have been found to influence the risk for type 1 diabetes. You might be thinking, why didn't we tell you about all of them? And the reason is we don't know all of the genes that influence the risk. And two, scientists haven't really figured out the best way to add these things together. So we know that these genes work together in different ways, which means they're not each independent. You can't add up 1 risk plus 2 risks plus 3 risks. That's not the way it works. So you could say, well, maybe we should multiply it out. Well, do they all contribute evenly? The bottom line is there's a lot of questions about how to put these risks together. So rather than guessing at it and really making up a number, what we've decided is we're going to give you one piece of information, one risk factor, to give you a little bit of insight. And as we figure out how to put these numbers together, we'll give you more. We'll give you sort of a total score when scientists, and it's not just here at Cornell, but people are working on this around the world. So as we figure out how we can give you an accurate number, we'll revise our reports to give that to you. But for right now, we feel like the science just isn't there to enable us to do that. So variants in the HLA complex, that region that I just talked about, where you have multiple genes that affect the risk for type 1 diabetes, accounts for 40 to 50% of this genetic risk for type 1 diabetes. So we know that a lot of it is happening in this one area of the genome. We've tested for just one of those genes. So again, just to give you the perspective that we think it's important to give you insight. It's one more piece of information that you didn't have before. We want to make it clear that it's not everything. This cannot diagnose you with type 1 diabetes. So we looked specifically at this HLA-DQA gene, and we looked at a particular variant, so one letter in your whole genome sequence, and tried to figure out which one do you have. Do you have an A or a G? And you might remember that you have 2 copies at every point in your genome. You got 1 copy for mom and 1 copy of dad. So when you get your results, you're always going to see either AA, GA, GG. You're going to see a combination of 2 letters that reflects your 2 copies, what you got from mom and what you got from dad. In this case, we've been looking at a protective versus a non-protective variant. And this is a little bit different than everything else we've told you about, because we've in the past been telling you about risk variants, things that actually increase your risk above other people. And in this case, we're looking at something protective. And it's a difficult concept to understand, I think. We've had a number of questions about why is this one protective, or how did you pick which one was protective versus risk. So this is sort of a way to think about it. I'm not a particularly athletic person. One could even say that I'm clumsy. Okay? There's no way I'm making it into the NBA or any other professional sports team. I'm not going to make it to the NFL, the NHL, anyone else you can think of, and I'm certainly never going to the Olympics. I would imagine that's true of most of the people in this room. Don't want to make assumptions, but a few of you may be super athletes, but I'm going to imagine the most of you fall into the same group that I do, right? So does that make the majority clumsy? Is it negative? Or does it make the few that are athletic, athletic, and everyone else is non-athletic? Does that make sense? So is the exception a positive thing or a negative thing? You want to make the standard, what applies to most people, sort of the neutral level. Does that make sense? Makes sense. So in this case, the particular variant in this gene that's seen most common, we're calling, is the A variant. Remember, you can have either an A or a G. And so we're calling that the standard. And when we look at people who have 1 or 2 copies of the A variant versus people who have 2 copies of G, the people who have 2 copies of G have a lower risk. So we're calling GG protective, and we're calling AA non-protective. So I'm the non-athlete. I would have the non-protective variant, because that's what the majority of people have. Does that make sense? Does anybody have any questions about that? Just want to see if I missed anything.
Single variant, single protection of the 2 genes.
If you're 1 in 1,
yeah,
then you fall actually in the middle. So you do actually have some protective effect, but it's not quite as low as having 2 copies of the protective.
So what makes it go up then, from standard to risk? What, in this particular case?
So in this particular case, you can't go up. Okay? Now if we flipped it around, we could say, okay, let's call this one the standard. Even though it doesn't happen in the majority of the people, if we set the bar for G, instead of setting it here, if we set it here, then people with A would be at an increased risk. Because we're comparing one group to another, it's a question of who you're using as the reference. But generally, you tend to use the reference as what the most common is. So in this case, the most common is the standard, and a variation from the standard is actually protective. There are other genes and other variants that can increase other genes that can increase your risk. But if we are looking particularly at this one, there's nothing about this that's going to increase your risk. So in thinking specifically about your CPMC results, You can always find your personal result. So there's a lot of information on these pages. Some of it is general. So for example, when you see the scales at the beginning of your results, that's general. That applies to everyone. If you and your wife look at it, you're going to have the same scale, right? Because the contribution of genetic versus not is a universal thing. On this page, this information is genetic. I've covered it with the red bar, but this says population risk. But here is your personalized result. It always says your result. And you'll see what we found when we looked at your gene. 2 copies of the non-protective variant were found. So again, we're providing results for 1 genetic variant. Each person has 2 copies, 1 from mom and 1 from dad. And we're looking to see if you have the protective or non-protective variant.
And what do you want?
And what do you want?
Which one do you want?
In theory, you want the protective variant. I mean, you want to be protected against type 1 diabetes.
Okay.
So you want to be able to say your risk is lower than somebody else's.
So some people can have 2 of those, and some people can have none of those.
Exactly.
And some people have 1 and 1.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so this page will tell you, in the population, how many people have 2 of the non-protective, 2 of the protective, and 1 of each. This is just trying to give you a sense of where you are in the population. Do you have a result that 1 in a million people have? Do you have what most people have? What's the most common? Where do you fall? So this is really just population data to give you a little perspective. Did you have a question, sir?
Does this work for type 2 as well as type 1?
This particular gene does not, but you have a separate result in your account for type 2 diabetes. So again, different mechanism. One is autoimmune, one is caused by other factors, and so they're influenced by different genes. This page will tell you, in the population, how many people have 2 of the non-protective, 2 of the protective, and 1 of each. This is just trying to give you a sense of where you are in the population. Do you have a result that 1 in a million people have? Do you have what most people have? What's the most common? Where do you fall? So this is really just population data to give you a little perspective. Did you have a question, sir?
Does this work for type 2 as well as type 1?
This particular gene does not, but you have a separate result in your account for type 2 diabetes. So again, different mechanism. One is autoimmune, one is caused by other factors, and so they're influenced by different genes. So there's some additional information on there for those of you who are information seekers. If you wanted to Google for more information, this is the scientific reference number for this gene, although we call it variant 1 as a reference point. So in the future, if we could give you variant 2 and variant 3, this is what's in the scientific literature. And if you were to Google, this is the number you would want to look at. Over here, we basically give you the address. Where in your genes can you find this particular variant? In looking at your personal results, these are the results for somebody who has 2 copies of the protective variant. So their bar is right here. So 1 is the baseline in this picture. Above 1 is an increased risk. Below 1 is a decreased risk. So here, in somebody with this decreased risk, someone with 2 copies of the G variant is 92% less likely. That's about 15 times less likely to develop type 1 diabetes than somebody who has 2 copies of the A variant. So it's actually a fairly significant impact on your risk. It brings you down a lot. On the other hand, family history, if you have a family history of type 1 or type 2 diabetes, this takes into account both, your risk of developing type 1 diabetes is about 6 times. So these are actually fairly significant. When you think about some of the other information we've given you, sometimes it's 1.2 times, 1.3 times, 15 times, and 6 times is actually a significant impact on your risk here. One of the questions that we sometimes get is, well, I did this for my children, or I'm interested in what the impact is on my children. So at these educational sessions, we try to share with you what the impact would be if you tried to think about the impact on your children, okay? it is not possible to look at one person's results. So I couldn't look at my results and predict what my child was going to have, right? Because I'm not the only contributing factor. My husband plays a role too. He doesn't always get much say around the house, but he impacted the kids. So if you are going to pass on one of your 2 copies to every child you have. Which version you pass is like flipping a coin. It's completely random. You have no control over it. So one child could get, in this case, the big D, which is a protective variant, or in the other case, the little n, which is the non-protective variant. Every child has a 50-50 chance of getting either of the 2 copies you have. Now, if you only have 2, let's say, non-protective copies, then that's what each of your kids is going to get from you. You only have a non-protective copy to pass. They're going to get that from you. But if your partner is, say, a mix or has 2 protective copies, it's unclear what they're going to get. You can extrapolate it out, and we could come up with a little table that would figure out what the likelihood is, but without knowing what your partner has, we're not entirely able to predict that. So in this case, if you had somebody who had 1 copy of each, and then 2 copies of the non-protective, there would be a 25% chance that this child would get 1 copy of each, a 25% chance that they would have 2 non-protective copies, a 25% chance, you would add these 2 together, so a 50% chance of 1 of each, and a 50% chance of 2 non-protective copies, or 0 copies of the protective variant. And again, different combinations if you each have 1 copy of each. So just a few limitations. Hopefully everybody has read this page on at least one of the copies of their results, but it's really important to remember that this information can't diagnose you with this condition. It also doesn't rule it out. So even if you have 2 copies of the protective variant, doesn't mean that you could never ever get diabetes. Because again, thinking back to those scales, there are other things that influence your risk. I'm sorry, this is really hard to read. There are...
I think the key limitation for type 1 diabetes was just that the genetic variant had been looked at in populations up to age 31, or after age 31. There was a limitation about the age. That was the only thing that was kind of different, and then the fact that it was a protective variant.
So what Tara just said is, all of the data that we give back to you is based on studies that have been done in the population. And the studies that we're using here started with people at age 31. So for those of you in the audience who are between the ages of 18 and 31, this data may not apply to you. There is a general pattern that it follows, but we do like to be clear what population we drew the data from. You'll often see on the bottom of different pages it says this is based on data from Caucasian populations, because we want somebody who's, say, Asian or African American to know that this was not done in their population, and it may not be exactly the same in someone of a different race or ethnicity.
Are you saying race is really one of the main factors?
What race influences strongly is this. So it can have a strong influence on the distribution. So it may be that what is less common in the Caucasian population is more common from a genetic standpoint in an African American population or an Asian population. And that's true with these types of variants, just like it's true with every genetic disease. So for example, in the Caucasian population, cystic fibrosis, which is a hereditary lung disease, is very common. In the African American population, sickle cell disease is very common, and it's something you don't usually see in Caucasians. So it's just sort of what's the likelihood of a variant being present, and that differs by different ethnicities.
Can I ask a question, or maybe make a correction?
Mm-hmm.
I heard you just say that the data is valid past 31, but my copy here says that all the data that have derived here is for data that was on individuals diagnosed with type 1 diabetes before age 31.
Before age 31.
So I think you might have had it backwards.
I apologize.
What I'm suggesting.
I apologize. In some cases, the data for the different charts that you see are based on different populations. So the best thing to do is actually what you just did and look at what we've told you on the individual page.
Right.
And I'm going to make sure that our limitations page is correct. So thank you for pointing that out.
But you're not saying that the data does not also apply to beyond 31, but it's not as clear that it's
It has not
accurate.
been studied in that population.
That's the point.
So we're drawing on a study that looked at adults but stopped at age 31. Thank you for pointing that out. So the last thing I want to point out is we do try and give you different resources. Obviously, we hold education sessions. These are always listed in addition to the slew of emails that you've all gotten from us. These are listed on the What Do I Do Now tab. You can also email in a question. You can schedule to talk to us about your personal results. And this will bring you back to the educational page for the disease. We have fairly extensive educational material on each of the diseases that we talk about, and at the bottom of each of those there's a list of resources, other websites, some of which overlap with the ones that Dr. Haddad had put up. So if you didn't get a chance to write that down and you wanted to look back at those, feel free to check out our health conditions page for type 1 diabetes and you'll find those links there.